everyday life. Thank you so much for choosing to be present here this evening to co-create this experience. We are confident that the presentations by our distinguished panelists and your comments and questions that will follow will make this evening a rich and valuable exchange. Special thanks to the university libraries for sponsoring this event and providing the refreshments. We appreciate that very, very much. So as you know by your presence, mindfulness has emerged as a very important topic within many academic disciplines and professions, in nonprofit and the business sector and elsewhere. Based on time-honored contemplative practices, mindfulness has gained increased attention in the Western world as neuroscience and other fields have begun to explore the effects of this practice on the human brain and human physiology. Dr. Rick Hanson's book, Buddha's Brain, The Practical Neuroscience of Happiness, Love, and Wisdom, made important contributions to disseminating this knowledge. This evening, our panel will discuss the themes covered in the book and explore ways that mindfulness is being applied in their areas of expertise and or their personal transformation. As we proceed, there are a few questions that panelists and our subsequent discussions are sure to address. One of them is the basic question of what is mindfulness and why is it important? Another is, what do findings from neuroscientific research and research from other fields tell us about the effects of mindfulness on the brain and the body, as well as how these effects are linked to experiencing a more peaceful, compassionate, and balanced life. Another important question that tonight will address is, how can we apply Hanson's ideas and other research about mindfulness to support us as we engage current social problems like education, health, and other disparities? And how can those ideas help us to manage the challenges of our current political climate, as well as address other contemporary issues? And finally, what can those who are new to mindfulness do to begin experiencing its benefits? To address these questions and so much more, our distinguished panel members will each present for 10 to 12 minutes, followed by audience questions and comments, which should start around 7 o'clock. And now to introduce our panel. Dr. Heinz-Dieter Meyer is Professor of Education here at the University of Albany. His work focuses on education, policy, and ethics. A native of Germany, he has taught in France, Germany, and the United States, and held visiting appointments at Peking University, Boston University, Penn State, and the East-West Institute in Honolulu. He has published or edited 6 books and over 50 articles and chapters, including most recently, The Design of the University and PISA, Power and Policy. He was a Harnett Fellow at Harvard University and has received numerous awards, including one that he recently received from the National Endowment for the Humanities. In his teaching, he explores the benefits of mindfulness for education, organizations, and leadership, and his meditation practice includes spending several weeks a year in silent retreat. Next, Dr. Erika Mukherjee is Associate Professor of German Studies and Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Union College, and a practicing SGI Buddhist. A recent graduate of Teachers College, Columbia University's inaugural Spirituality, Mind, Body Institute Master's Program. And she's also a current student at Columbia University's inaugural Narrative Medicine Certification Program. She considers herself a lifelong learner with strong interest in alternative healing modalities and meditative practices. Her academic research focuses on transnational identity, transformational aspects of Orphic poetry, modern retelling of myths in contemporary film and literature, systemic constellations work, spot culture, and global citizenship. She has a background in meditation, mediation, hospice, and human-centered education that promotes well-being and happiness. Beside her, there is Dr. Loretta Pyles. She is professor at the University of Albany SUNY School of Social Welfare. She is a yoga and meditation teacher, workshop leader, and organizational consultant. Her new books include Healing Justice, Holistic Self-Care for Change Makers, and Production of Disaster and Recovery in Post-Earthquake Haiti, Disaster Industrial Complex. Her research on disasters and resilience has been funded by the National Science Foundation. She's also author of Progressive Community Organizing, Reflective Practice in the Global World, and co-editor with England Adam of Holistic Engagement, Transformational Social Work Education in the 21st Century. Her practice background is in the areas of crisis and trauma, violence against women, economic justice, and workplace. And finally, to my far left is Dr. James Steller. As a professor of behavioral neuroscience for 30 years, first at Harvard University and then at Northeastern University, Dr. Steller studied the basic neurobiology of reward motivational processes. In 1998, he became the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Northeastern and served in this role for 10 years. During this period, the college promoted experiential education, or XED, as a powerful complement to a classical college curriculum. In 2009, he was appointed as provost at Queens College, CUNY, and in 2015 as provost here at the University at Albany SUNY. He's also served as interim president during the last year. 15 years ago, he co-founded and continues to co-direct the WACE Planning Institute on XED, which has helped 100 universities develop programs, and he has consulted on national XED programs in Thailand and Namibia. He writes a blog on experiential education and has published a recent book and very relevant to the conversation today. The book is entitled Education That Works, The Neuroscience of Building a More Effective Higher Education. As a professor myself here in the School of Social Welfare and one who has deep excitement and enthusiasm about the topics that are going to be discussed today, I am thrilled and excited for the panel to make their presentations so that we can learn from their vast storehouse of knowledge. They will speak in order that, and I mean that, they will speak in, my name is Solomon, by the way, I didn't say that, but you see it there. And they will speak in the order that they were introduced. Please.
Which is the alphabetic order, by the way.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rahim. Good evening, everybody, and very welcome. Very good of you to come to this event. When we talk about mindfulness, we can talk about it in one of two ways. We can talk about it purely academically, as if it was another academic subject using just our head. But I think it's more fruitful if we allow a degree of opening that is typically not to be necessary in the lecture room, opening our all our senses, our hearts and mind, and to do that in a time-efficient way. I thought it might be good to just hear two poems that I think are very, to me, very powerful in conveying what mindfulness is all about. And they both happen to be by the Sufi poet, 13th century poet Rumi. Many of you will have heard of him. And so that I don't talk over time myself, I've asked two students to help out. Matt, would you go ahead and read the first one, The Guest House? Maybe you get up and speak.
I can get up.
I can project.
The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond.
Thank you, Matt. And one more. The second one is on your sheet, and Shiamara.
There are two kinds of intelligence. One acquired as a child in school, memorizes facts and concepts from books and from what the teacher says, collecting information from the traditional sciences as well as from new sciences. With such intelligence, you rise in the world. You get ranked ahead or behind others in regard to your competence in retaining information. You stroll with this intelligence in and out of fields of knowledge, getting always more marks on your preserving tablets. There's another kind of tablet, one already completed and preserved inside of you. A spring overflowing in its spring box, a freshness in the center of the chest. This other intelligence does not turn yellow or stagnant. It is fluid and it doesn't move from outside to inside through the conduits of plumbing learning. This second knowing is a fountainhead, from within you, moving out.
Thank you. So, when we talk about mindfulness, we talk about a state of heart and mind that is rather different from the state that we normally bring to an academic lecture. When we go to an academic lecture, our head is on, nothing much else needs to be on. We, receive information, we compute it, and we may leave on a good day with some, gains in rational insight. But for the most part, our heart remains unchanged. We come with a heart that's as, developed or undeveloped as we came in with. Mindfulness requires a different being in the world in a different way. It requires that we are here not just gathering information, but being present to all that is in the room, to all that is in the world. And so when I teach and explore mindfulness in my classes, I often introduce it with a few exercises in meditation. I'm not going to do that tonight, but I just want to begin by pointing out that we're not discussing a purely academic subject. We're discussing our way of being in the world. I came to mindfulness in a way by chance. I had a sabbatical, which thankfully the university still gives you every so often. And I had, some friends had told me about Zen monasteries in Japan, and that you can actually go there and, sit for meditation. So I did that about 10, 12 years ago, and I spent 10 days sitting in meditation, 8 hours a day, and largely silent and so forth. And late as it was in my life, it still blew me away in terms of how it afforded me to look at myself differently. I had gone there, as an academic with certain experience, with a certain academic training and so forth. So I had all rights to think of myself as a rational person. But what I saw when I sat there for, the 10 days was something entirely different. I saw a mind that was going, in hindsight, I would say, like a loose cannon on deck. It was, shooting scattershot at no particular target at all. It was pursuing thoughts wildly and uncontrollably. It was engaging in conversations. It was writing letters of, to the editor and letters to my colleagues and so on. It was just uncontrolled. And I wasn't going mad or anything. I was just sitting quietly. But my mind was doing things that I would never have expected a mind could do. I thought of myself as I can think of what I want to think. No, I found that, my mind had a life of its own, and I was not in charge. So, coming away from that, I sort of realized, and this is for the first time in my life as a, advanced adult, as you can tell, for the first time in my life, I thought the standard operating procedure on which I was working up until then was wrong. And that was, if something goes wrong, look outside. That had been my standard operating procedure. If something is difficult, if something goes wrong, find the cause outside. And I was terrifically effective at doing that. My wife can tell you about that. My daughter, my dogs, they were still alive. I would find fault with anything and anyone except me. And this experience changed that. It still took a long time to really sink in, to a level of depth, but it was the starting point for really looking at me and my education in a new way. And here I am, a professor of education, presumably telling people what education is all about, and I would really say that up until then, I've at best talked about half of what they needed to know. And then a second thing happened, 2008. The country came this close to collapse and ruin. It managed to saddle the first African-American president to dig us out of the mess, making a hell of a job for his first 4 years for him. And I reflected that the people who had been responsible for this crisis, many of whom, if not most of whom, had MBAs from Harvard and similar places, had all been through the kinds of courses I was teaching, where I was teaching about rational decision making and group dynamics and communication and even ethics. They had all taken these courses, and still they ended up manufacturing financial instruments that they knew would ruin people and would send them to lose their houses and would have to sleep in their cars and so forth and so on. So that was the second awakening, if you will, for me. And with these two things together, I decided I can't teach the way I've taught up until then. I can't treat this mindfulness thing as a private matter that I practice on my own, and draw the line. I have to let this inform my work and my teaching. And as some of the students who are here tonight can testify, I've introduced it into the teaching, and I would claim it has rejuvenated my interest in teaching, and it also has, I think, made a big difference in the quality of what students are able to learn. So the main takeaway from what I've said so far is that we are at a point where we have to rethink how we do education. And this is an insight that I think is shared increasingly both with teachers in public schools as well as in higher education. We have to reimagine the student in many ways. And we have to wake up to the fact that up until now, we have only thought of the student in half of their capacity, which is their cognitive, rational intelligence, the one intelligence that Rumi is talking about here that gets you ahead in the world and, you know, that makes you remember facts and so forth. But the other intelligence that is required, that some voice will speak up when you are about to be drawn into concocting financial instruments, or at Volkswagen you create a deceptive system of computers that, you know, turn the exhaust off just when they when they are about to be managed. I mean, imagine that, right? These are totally rational people that know exactly what they're doing, and they're out to deceive the world just in order to get ahead of Toyota. So we need to redesign our education so that a wake-up call, a wake-up bell rings in the heads of and hearts of these people when they're about to be pulled into something like this, where they say, no, we can't do this. You know, this is not what we signed up for. So, oh, geez. Well, see, for this event where I get the 0-minute sign, I have prepared this handout here. So my 5-minute elevator pitch, I'll reduce it to 2 minutes on one of the 2 pages. So mindfulness, there's obviously, you know, a wealth of definitions, but mine, short one is mindfulness is being alive to all of our experience. And that means specifically not just what happens out there, but what happens in here. So when you're kind of on the highway, there are 2 things that are part of your experience. And usually we only notice one. One is there's a guy cutting you off, maybe even deliberately or recklessly or whatever. The other event that is happening is you get very mad. And that event we often don't notice, and we respond because in ignorance of this event that we are mad. Whereas if we knew and allow ourselves to be aware of the second event, we can actually say, okay, big deal, jerk cut me off, you know, I don't have to retaliate. Whereas if you don't know that the second event is happening, so why meditate? So that there is an adult in the room that actually prevents you from doing this, you know, gesturing at this person or going after him. I was capable of that in my day. How does mindfulness introduce the adult into decision making? Well, if you practice sufficiently, it creates a baseline where you know what it feels like for your mind to be in a state of quiet, in a state of tranquility, in a state of peace. And there's an alert sent to your brain when you deviate from that baseline. And when you get that alert, you, if you have some training, you know to take a deep breath and not to act. That's what happens. I'll save the other points maybe for the discussion if you're interested. Maybe just a final thing. I love talking about how mindfulness is not only, I mean, I consider myself that I've learned mostly from Buddhist mindfulness practice, but I love pointing out that it is not at all exclusive to Buddhism or to any particular. And I love this quote from Blaise Pascal, that the rational mind believes it is in control, but a very easy way to find, to show that it's not, is to put the most rational people, namely the philosopher, on a plank that he knows or she is firmly lodged to the ground. Nothing can happen, but put them there on over an abyss, and they will experience terror. They will experience fear, and no amount of analysis, no amount of discursive thinking will take that fear away. And the point being that we need to address both systems that make our decisions for us, and not just the one on top. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I love the focus on sort of turning our vision onto ourselves. I have taught for about 20 years now, I think. And first of all, thank you for welcoming me to your campus. It's a beautiful campus, and I am really happy to be here. But I love the sort of turn on ourselves. As academics, we typically don't do that. And I'm here today, I teach German studies at Union College, but I'm here today to really speak of meditation and mindfulness as a lived experience. And a friend of mine in academia told me, this is really the next frontier. We hope it's the final frontier, but it's the frontier because most times in academia you do not talk about sort of the personal, but I am a feminist at heart, and I do believe the personal is political. And I think that this is, meditation has helped me tremendously. It's guided me throughout my academic career. I always had sort of a dual track. And I will be reading part of my experience because I want to have it as full as possible. But before I do that, I thought that maybe all of us could just take a few deep breaths together. There's something about breathing together that's really transformative. So just be comfortable in your seat. And I always like to focus first on the feet. So really feel your feet on the ground. And maybe first begin by just staring right ahead of you. And then just soften your gaze so that you're actually, without moving your eyes, you're taking in all of the periphery. And then look straight ahead again and notice that perhaps your vision has expanded. And go ahead and just close your eyes for a moment. And let's just breathe together. Rick Hansen says 4. Let's count to 4 inhalations in. Briefly hold, and then 4 exhalations out. Let's do that together for 3 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Just hold the breath. And exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Inhaling one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhaling 1, 2, 3, 4. And you might already begin to hear that mind. Am I doing it right? Am I going too fast? Just be with that. Last inhalation in 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's beautiful. You feel that silence, how quickly we have access to that. So I'd like to share how my experience in meditation is not just a gateway to peace, happiness, love, and wisdom, but also to positive transformation and inner revolution. The Buddhist philosopher and teacher Daisaku Ikeda contends that, quote, a great human revolution in just a single individual will help achieve a change in the destiny of a nation, and further will enable a change in the destiny of all humankind. And I remember when I first heard that, I thought, wow, that sounds daunting, and that has nothing to do with me. But having now practiced for over 16 years, I realized that it also includes me, and slowly I've found my place with that quote in the world. So, who am I to do great things was one of my big questions. My own human revolution was very difficult and has been difficult for many, many years. And I know that even with the 16 years of practice, and I've actually been meditating since the 90s, I always feel like I'm at the beginning and always a beginner. And I think that is very much how one is. One's always at the edge of a new unknown with each breath, with each new moment that arises. So truly, it doesn't matter where, when, or how one begins. It's always now, this eternal now, being present to what is. It is worth noting, however, I have a little bug here too that's with me. Okay, yes, okay. It's worth noting that over time one does, however, start to collect some experiences and small pearls of wisdom and sees the effects of what mindfulness and meditation does in one's life, especially a daily practice. And I practice in the morning and the evenings. I have an open-eyed chanting practice. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, although I've done many different forms. But that's worked best for me. So I thought I'd just share a couple of those experiences. So I began meditating and practicing mindfulness in Austin, Texas during the 1990s. It was when Austin was still a hippie center. And I tried out various forms of self-help work. And I came to holotropic breath work. It's where a facilitator helps assist you to access greater awareness through deep breathing. And I had what I called a body memory. Now I know it's a somatic memory. It's pre-verbal. I had an understanding of being in my mother's womb at 6 months in utero and feeling her fear as she found out that she was going to have twins. I come from a lineage of twins where most of them have died at birth or shortly after birth. And I had a distinct understanding of my sister and I negotiating who would come into the world. And in a moment of what I consider ineffable joy and mischievous delight, we both decided, what the hell, let's just do it anyway. And there was this moment of luminosity in that moment that has stayed with me and reminded me that there is more going on here than what I've always experienced. And at first I didn't know what to make of that until I spoke with my mother, who, she has this wonderful German guilt, and immediately said, oh, I was like that, but I really was not that fearful, I just wasn't sure. And I realized that there was some sort of truth to this experience, my truth. Many people don't always understand. In the early 2000s, I felt there was a need to deepen my practice. There were formidable obstacles I faced, my life was in many ways falling apart. And my inner and outer selves didn't align. And it's at that point that I came to the practice that I practice now, which is SGI Buddhism, Nichiren Buddhism, which at its core has this mantra, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Nam meaning I dedicate myself. Myoho is to the wondrous or mystic law that goes beyond just rational mind. Of the Lotus Sutra, which is considered the highest teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha. It also, Renge symbolizes the lotus flower, which seeds and blossoms at the same time, and symbolizes the simultaneity of cause and effect. That whatever I say, do, and how I act has an effect in my life and in the environment around me. And then Kyo is sound, so Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. I didn't anticipate being part of any sort of organized religion, and I thought I could just practice by myself in the quietness of my home, but that's not the practice, with other practitioners. And soon, through regular practice, found that I was undergoing a sort of reorientation in my life, a re-education. How can one be together with others? How can one transform one's own self? My empathy grew, as did my understanding of the interconnections of my life with others. And I really began to have in my own life a deeper care for others and experience deeper trust with others. And there were many watershed moments where I didn't know how I would continue, and just chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, I felt I could breathe again and move forward. One of my earliest experiences was when I faced a very particularly difficult conversation with my department chair. I had just spent 8 hours in a colleague's appeal process speaking out against her, which was probably not wise as a junior faculty member. But I had to face the reality of those repercussions in the situation and in my academic work. I was so scared I would have done anything to avoid this conversation. But I chanted and took some breaths, quietening myself, opening myself up to this opportunity. What happened then surprised me. The conversation emerged with the greatest consideration and concern for each other. She admitted her mistakes, I admitted mine. We apologized, she offered ways to help me move forward in my life, support me academically. This meeting was something that I had never experienced before, and it ended with the co-chair who had witnessed our interaction sobbing in my arms. Very surreal, but I had never experienced anything like that. I knew something in me had changed, and I've had so many moments like that since I began meditating, and I feel that what meditation often is, it's not just a silencing of the mind, but it's that merging when one is when one has transcended the ego, one has a sense of presence, but also a possible future, that they come together in this sort of luminous moment. Last year was another one of those moments that surprised me in a beautiful way. My husband, Neil, who was a cancer patient, 7 years in remission, suddenly took an unexpected turn. His platelets had dropped to 3,000 and only 150,000, and he suffered 2 brain hemorrhages and was unable to speak. I was worried, but I know better than worry is to chant, and that's what I did. So I chanted in the evening, and there are moments in meditation that are crystal clear, and it was that sort of moment. I wanted to push through what was possible to see what might emerge, whether perhaps he could come out of this. And through chanting, I felt some sort of great peace overcome me. The next morning, he still could not speak during his first initial neuro checks. But then as all of the doctors assembled around him, suddenly he emerged and was able to speak again, not only in full sentences, but in what the fellows note as multisyllabic words. And it was one of those moments collectively that was so extraordinary, and I think this is why doctors do what they do, because we live for these moments, these sort of mystic moments that remind us of our own great potential that lies within. So for me, meditation has always been about how can I bring out that inner potential. In Buddhism, we talk about it being the inner Buddha nature. And I find that meditation has not only helped me change my attitude, my brain, but my life. And I believe that indeed meditation could help change the world. So thank you.
Thank you so much for both of these amazing presentations. It's really good to hear people's subjective experiences, and I'm always appreciative when people are disrupting the status quo of academia, reading poetry, talking about subjective spiritual experiences. So I'm happy to be a part of that. I'm actually not going to go that route though today. I'm going to play a little bit of a different role and talk a little bit about the book and bring a little bit of critical mindedness to the mindfulness movement. So this book, Buddha's Brain, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. What Hansen does is really bring together Buddhism and neuroscience and has created this incredible model that's very accessible and really makes neuroscience accessible to a lot of people. So it's just a fabulous resource in that regard. But one thing about this focus on neuroscience, and there's a real movement in terms of looking at the brain, using MRIs to look at what's going on in the brain when people meditate, is perhaps confirming what people who have already known for a long time, right? What indigenous people already know, what people who have wisdom and people who believe in different ways of knowing already know. That this work, it changes your heart, it changes your mind, it changes your embodied lived experience, it changes your relationships. And so sometimes I think that there can be a danger to bowing down to what I call the cult of men in white lab coats a little bit when we do this, and there's a potential danger. And one of the things that there's a potential danger with, and Hansen does address this in the book, is that the mind becomes equated with the brain. So, what is the human mind? Well, it's not just the brain, right? That's one part of what the human mind is. But the human mind, how we understand things, how we experience reality, how we relate to people, it's a socially constructed phenomenon. And it's a function of social systemic factors, the way we relate in families, right? It's much more than just kind of a radical materialism of the brain, right? So I think I take that critique from Evan Thompson, who's a philosopher and cognitive scientist. And I think potentially by this movement and this focus and this fixation on the brain and the brain science, again, really exciting and really important and really great in terms of helping us to bring an objective evidence base to this, when in fact all we've had is more subjective reports, and now we have sort of an objective evidence base. But what it is potentially doing is potentially reinforcing the individualism and narcissism of the culture, by focusing on the individual brain as the outcomes that we're interested in. So I invite you to sort of reflect on that and see what that might mean. I guess another potential concern is that mindfulness is sort of equated with Buddhism, and spiritual or sort of secular mindfulness has stripped down Buddhism and taken out the ethical underpinning. So, this path of awakening, this very old path of awakening to who we are, to what reality is, necessarily requires an ethical underpinning, in terms of how we treat others, underpinnings of compassion and non-harming and non-stealing and, not colonizing each other, right? And so that, I think that becomes really important as we look at what has been called McMindfulness, right? Sort of the commodification of mindfulness in the culture and potential concerns there. And so mindfulness has been used, for example, with the military, right? So making people in the military better, more relaxed and more able to focus and concentrate on shooting and killing people, right? Mindfulness has been used with CEOs and executives so that they can be more concentrated and focused on like raping and pillaging the earth, right? So, and moreover, if in taking up the field of education a little bit, mindfulness has been shown to have some incredible outcomes with children in high-stakes testing. And so, so it helps students concentrate more, it helps them relax in terms of like test anxiety and that sort of thing, and that's fantastic. But again, like maybe we should be like addressing the high-stakes testing in the first place that might not be serving them so well. Maybe we should be looking at the structural factors. Maybe we should be organizing kids and parents to resist these kinds of movements. So those are just some of the concerns around like the potential fixation on the secularization, the commodification of mindfulness. Relatedly, when we think about like behavioral health as like sort of, and mindfulness as an intervention in behavioral health, again, it's really powerful. We're starting to build this incredible body of evidence in terms of outcomes about addictions and anxiety and depression and physical health as well, all sorts of fantastic outcomes. But again, I wonder sometimes if that takes us a little bit off the hook and forces us or sort of gives us an opportunity not to have to look at the sort of systemic and structural factors that are contributing to anxiety, contributing to a depression and addiction. So I think there's a lot, if systemic work to be done. There's work to be done, what's going on with the community and neighborhood variables that might be, in fact, like more important than some of the behavioral health variables. So it can become a bit of a panacea, and so I think we just have to sometimes take a deep breath with it as well. And then finally, or maybe not quite finally, getting towards the finally, thinking about this issue of inclusivity and accessibility of mindfulness. So thinking about, the cover of Time magazine, or, these places where we see, mindfulness being advertised. Oftentimes the person that we see on there is this peaceful white person, or they're sitting on a beach and they're just got their legs crossed in this sort of twisty kind of position. And so we have to ask ourselves, who gets to be mindful? Who is it that gets to be mindful? And how might some of these messages be perpetuating the dangerous oppressions that exist in this culture? Might just this be a pathway that we're fixating on that's helping us to avoid maybe the real issues at hand? Yes, it helps us cope, yes, it helps us get through the day, and that's fantastic, and I'm all about that, and self-care, and it's incredibly helpful in that regard. And moreover, it can be incredibly helpful for people who are change makers, who are people on the front lines doing activism and organizing, and social workers and educators, right? People who are doing that work, and so it can be an incredible resource and boost resilience. So it's really important in that regard. So in terms of creating spaces that could be more inclusive, how do we do that? How do we create healing spaces that are more inclusive, that aren't excluding people, and how can we make it more accessible, right, to people with disabilities, to people who are differently abled, etc. And that can lead into maybe one of my final points, is that also mindfulness is actually contraindicated for some people, and I think that's a really important piece as well. People with extreme trauma that is unresolved, or extreme anxiety, for example, it can actually exacerbate things, right? Particularly the kind of mindfulness where we sit still and close our eyes and don't do anything, right? So that can actually make some people be even more anxious. It can bring back memories and trigger memories. So I think we have to be careful with how we're delivering mindfulness in different contexts. And we have to be really competent in terms of our ability to do that. And that being said, there are a lot of different options. I mean, as I said, as was mentioned, I'm a yoga teacher as well. And so there are different options in terms of using the body, getting into the body, and doing more movement-oriented practice. So for some people, a movement-oriented practice is going to be more relevant, or other kinds of practices that may be more helpful. So I think this question of cultural congruence and cultural relevance with people's lived experiences, their own social location, adapting mindfulness for ways that work for people is a really important part of this discussion. So I think that's actually all I'll say. So thanks. Yeah.
Well, thank you for letting me be part of this. Research shows that when you remember this talk, this panel discussion, you'll sort of mix together the order of the presentations, which is probably a good thing for me. Because what I want to do is to show you a little bit about how the brain works that I think has an impact on mindfulness, and certainly was in my presence when I read the book. And it has to do with I. The I that we have inside of us that we think is who we are. So let me begin with a demonstration. I am performing an act right now which MIT cannot do. And that is I walk. Put a little hop in it, and a spin. And I could do this when I was 2. But there is no computer at MIT that can walk on 2 legs like I'm doing right now.
Now, the reason that's important to my talk is that you think that's easy. You don't think about it. You think about where you're going, whether you're going to put a little hop on it. Even if you were an MD, even if you were a neurologist, even if you studied locomotion in the legs, you would have no felt experience of walking. But if you couldn't do that, you wouldn't be here. Because the beings that could in evolution would have eaten you. And you wouldn't be able to get food. Why? Because this is handled in a part of your brain that you do not have access to. Now, it's not true I don't have any access to it. I can go this way, I can go that way. But what's happening in the feet? You're ignorant of it. And you're arrogant about it. You don't even realize it's a miracle. Now let's go up a level in the brain. This is called by Paul MacLean the reptilian brain, the bottom brain. The middle brain is the brain of emotions and the limbic system. Emotions is a word that is often denigrated in our society. It's not quantitative, it's weak. It doesn't have a place in the rational culture of academia, as Heinz talked about. But yet, it turns out to underlie very important activities. So, for example, in 2011, a guy named Daniel Kahneman, a Princeton psychologist, published a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which was born out of his 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics. Why was this important? Well, economics at the time was built on rational choice theory, and the more people that were involved, the better we got at figuring out what the price of that stock was. What he studied was emotional decision-making, very powerful emotional decision-making, which went like this. She has that stock. He has that stock. She has that stock. She has that stock. I need that stock. And I stopped looking at the profit and loss statements, and I buy it, and we have a bubble. We pay $1,800 for a tulip bulb. Or we decide that mortgages are going to rise forever, so nobody's going to be hurt. And we walk into this over and over and over again as a science, as a society, because it's not rational. It is rational, but it's got this other component in it. And this goes to my favorite quote from Blaise Pascal, who says, "The heart has reasons, of which reason does not know." Now, the first part I've tried to establish with the walking thing. If you don't know how you walk, maybe you also don't know how you feel. But the other part is very important. The heart has reasons, yes, of which reason does not know. To tell you that story, I want to go to a cognitive neuroscience experiment by Mukherjee, who wrote the book Who's in Charge, which I recommend also reading. In this experiment, he had a subject who had a split brain, which means the hemispheres were divided by a surgical technique where they cut this broad band of fibers which connects both our left and the right hemispheres. This was done in the 60s to stop epilepsy. We don't do it anymore. We have other techniques, and it produces interesting effects. The first thing they noticed was when the patients emerged from the surgery, they were fine. They could walk, they could put their clothes on. But then they began to do studies with them with this very interesting machine. It's very simple. It's a slide projector. And you look at the center of the screen, and the picture flashes on this side. Very quickly, about a tenth or 2/10 of a second, enough so you can see what it is. It's a ball. Now, because it's on the right side, especially if you're like me, a right-handed male, that is handled by the left hemisphere. And the patient says, "Ball. I saw a ball." If you do the same experiment, looking at the center of the screen, flash over here, goes into the right hemisphere, and the patient says, "I saw nothing." Because it's only the left side in a right-handed patient that speaks. I saw nothing. I saw nothing. However, it also happens that the left and the right hand are controlled by the opposite hemisphere, just like the vision is switched hemispheres. Why it's switched, you have to ask God. So the left hand was previously trained in this experiment to go into a little box out of sight and pick out the object. And the object on the left side was the key. Now, flash them both together. Patient says, "I saw a ball," and then the patient notices their hand is holding a key because the eyes are moving around the room. It flashes over. Now they have a unified theory of self. This thing, it's the language module, is Erika calls the interpreter module because its job is to make a rational story out of your life all the time. every minute. Make you look good. So the patient says something that my students say do it in their tests, but they know they're doing it. He makes it up. He said, well, you need the key to get the balls out of the cabinet because they're locked. It's like, where'd that come from? And they don't know they're doing it. So we are like that patient, except we can connect the thoughts on either side and we don't have to use our left hand or our right hand. And that's, for me, the message that I got as a non-Buddhist, although I do meditate on my own and probably improperly, but I do it a lot. You didn't know this. That's what I'm doing when I'm in my office when I'm not answering. And the reason I want to do that is I want to get around, dissolve that I, because that I leads us into trouble. Two more little things to say. We can talk about them later. One is that I was taught when I was a young man that the selfish gene uses humans to make another gene. That turns out to be wrong. The selfish gene is in a group, and that group is really good at helping those genes and me survive. We can divide labor, we can work back and forth. So when I was a young man and I taught my first classes in neuroscience, I taught about this reflex involving this thing called oxytocin, where the baby nurses at the mother's breast, the tactile stimulation goes to the pituitary, causes the release of oxytocin, comes down, causes the smooth muscles in the breast to contract, puts the milk into the vestibule so the baby can actually get some. It's a two-organism neuroendocrine reflex. It was so cool because I could get like 9 things done in 30 seconds. And it isn't surprising that evolution might have made oxytocin responsible for bonding between the mother and the infant, which is kind of important. But men haven't. What are men doing with oxytocin? And you know what the best way to release oxytocin? Think about it. Well, I can only do that with him because I know him and he actually likes me a little. It has to be a welcome hug. And if you release oxytocin that way, or if you just put it in your system, which you can do, you are more generous in a neuroeconomic scheme. You share more of your resources with the people in your tribe. Now, you could say, why don't we just put it in the water at the University of Albany, make us all get along? Because it has another effect. If there's an out-group, if it's a different group, a different skin color, a different gender, maybe they're from Virginia Tech and we're playing them in football, and we say, kill Virginia, it makes it worse. So you can't use oxytocin unless you believe you're all one tribe. So the group has a very powerful effect. And we need a book by a Buddhist on modern group dynamics, which is taking over social psychology. My daughter's an assistant professor of one at the University of Toronto. And it really emphasizes how we are so much better and stronger together. And this gene thing was wrong. Last point. And I'm not going to talk about this. If you want to read about this, you can look at my book because it's in there. Excuse me for that plug. I was also taught that when you're my age, or your age, it's too late to change your brain. That what you can do is to make little tiny connections so that you can remember things. And that organic storage of these little tiny connections is supposed to be how we remember stuff. Because there is hardware, and that hardware does stuff just like it does in your computer. That turns out to be wrong. Neuroplasticity is impossible in adults. It's possible. It just takes a while. In fact, it takes focused, concentrated practice and probably several years. It takes about the time that it takes to go to college. So my last point is that higher education, this answers the question you asked me, has an opportunity to really rewire brains. And maybe we shouldn't do this, because it's maybe not our job to do that. But if we taught in a more mindful way, if we taught in a more ethical way, if we used experiences to bring people together, if we didn't tell them about it, but we sent them to feel it, if we sent them on internships, if we sent them on study abroad, if we did all these experiential things, and we did it over and over again, mindfully for 4 years, we could possibly rewire their brains. So it's an awesome power. I don't know that we deserve it, but it's going to happen anyway, so why don't we use it for good? Thank you.
Wow, that was just so fantastic. beginning, as I imagine yours is as well. So now we have until, we have about a little more than 20 minutes for questions and comments. And we can do this in one of two ways. I believe that Mike is there because it's working. And so if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, you could go to that mic. There's also a mic here that we can bring you. And that's going to, oh, that mic is not working. So, but this one is, we'll bring you this one.
Or you can just stand up and speak loud.
If someone speaks loudly but doesn't have a mic, will the recording be done? Not so much. So we would love to get your question on the recording, and we promise to be swift in getting to you.
Well, I actually have a question.
There you go.
I know that there are some programs, I mean, and I'm aware of one here in Albany, where they take the month of January, I think, and encourage everyone to join in a sort of group meditation. In your own home, but you do your group meditation, and they try to see if that has like a citywide effect, improving maybe less crime or other things. And I'm wondering if any of you can kind of speak to that type of joining meditation. I think it goes back to what Dr. Steller said, where we're better in a group, but that's my question.
I could say something. I think you're referring to the Albany Peace Project.
Yes.
Yeah, so the Albany Peace Project, I don't know a lot about what they're doing, but I believe my understanding, and they have some connection to University at Albany actually, but I believe what they're doing is doing an experiment to see if a bunch of people got together in a community and meditated, would there be an impact on crime rates and other kinds of outcome in a particular neighborhood. I don't know what the results of that research are. I do know a little bit about the research on intercessional prayer and other forms of prayer, and there is evidence that actually prayer and intercessional prayer, where you're actually praying on behalf of somebody, actually has resulted in some positive health outcomes. I don't know much more than that, and I don't think it's a huge body of research, but I'm not sure what's happening exactly in terms of more around meditation.
Well, thank you so much.
But I teach community organizing, so my suggestion would be, rather than meditating, maybe get out there and work in the community and organize.
I would add one thing about that, because I think what's really powerful, even as one's going out into the community, is to take some sort of time to, as a group, to also really either stand with each other, breathe with each other, take a moment, collectively kind of gather oneself. I think that's really one of the most powerful things. We underestimate how interconnected we are and how different we are. And so I know that in group dynamics, it really helps if there's some sort of common purpose, something that joins us, and where we still maintain our individuality. But I know that chanting together in a group, it brings me in contact with people who I probably would otherwise never meet, never know how to interact with. And that sort of common shared baseline makes dialogue, conversation, group activity all the more stronger.
She's actually got a very good point. You notice that she had us breathe together. That's kind of synchronous activity has been shown in classrooms to promote more coherent dialogue. If you just have the students stand up and do this together, that coherence. And the argument is that this is what the military figured out a long time ago, which is why they have boot camp. You don't die for your country. You don't die for your principles. You die for the person next to you in the foxhole because you're bonded, and you're bonded because they make you do synchronous stuff like marching. And so I think there's a lot of research on that that suggests that you're right, and you were very smart to have us breathe, because it made this audience more gentle to us.
That was it. That was the plan.
that at all what Ms. talked about through
We
that?
can't hear very well.
Some Asian corporations.
It's not working. Sorry.
Just speak loud.
Try this.
That's okay. Some corporations and cultures will also do that, the group dynamics, where people will work together on projects, but actually have, whether it's group exercises or Tai Chi or things like that, to focus their energies together. Is that not unlike what the military does too? But for a very different end, obviously.
Since I have the microphone, I'll make a quick answer and then pass to my panel colleagues. Yes, it's absolutely the case. And when I was in Boston at Northeastern, I was pretty close to City Year and its founder, and they opened every conference with exercises. They made Bill Clinton exercise when he came to address them. You had to do it with them first. It's almost cultish unless you know them and you know the people in it, and then it has exactly this effect. So it's not just the Chinese foreign cultures. They did it for social good, because if you know City Year, it's a whole process of working in the neighborhoods, doing this kind of interaction, and I think it makes them feel more powerful as a group. So the answer is a resounding yes, we should all do it.
Well, just a quick observation. When I was visiting schools in China, they do calisthenics in the morning as a group. It's very time and space efficient. You can just everyone needs just a square yard where you can do your calisthenics, but it creates a group cohesion and it creates a group feeling. And then when you go into the public parks, you see old people doing Tai Chi in groups and so forth. So it's a very different tradition, and I think it would be lovely if we could import some of that to this country. Yes.
I can speak loudly if you can hear me, or I can. So, my question is, what happens when you reach that point where you understand the decisions that you're making are wrong? And you're in that group dynamic, you're in that group think, whatever you want to call it. How do you pull yourself out of that? And I'm asking because I'm just thinking of that military example that was given, where we have individuals who are in the military, who are doing what they're doing because they think it is right. They've been trained to think it is right. They're saving the person next to them. All very notable and high level qualities we want individuals to have. But they're also taking a gun and killing someone. How can we use meditation to deal with those contradictions? Can you, within yourself, kind of rationalize that kind of contradiction? And what happens to us when we do that? I mean, that's a major concern of mine, because we all live contradictions. We might see them a little bit more effectively than others, some, but we all live them. And I'm just wondering, how do you kind of get beyond those contradictions, especially the examples that you were given, where you said you had those conflicts, you had those issues. How did you get beyond recognizing that you were wrong and needing to do something about it?
I think sometimes it's the insight that comes, right? Is that I think very often it's recognizing it. We talk about fundamental darkness, our own fundamental darkness, where we somehow think it's not us, it's everyone else, right? If everyone else would just change. And so I think that, meditation offers a sort of inner spiritual mirror, where you are sort of confronted with your own self, your mind, like you spoke about your mind racing. And with, I can speak from my own practice, there are times when there is a clarity that emerges from my mind, because in many ways the ego awareness is changed, softens, and I have a sense of the sort of greater self. And I can recognize aspects of myself, I can recognize aspects of the group dynamics, and within, so part of the practice I have is also chanting, is that you understand that you can start making new causes in your life. You can start making better causes in your life, right? And you begin to understand the sanctity of human life, your own life, other people's life, the interconnectedness, that there's really truly a oneness of self and environment, and that your environment is often mirroring something within you. I think that there is a great benevolence in our universe. So even if we are not out there fighting or killing people, we might find in ourselves that we have seeds of anger that justify, insulting someone or belittling them or, excluding them in all sorts of ways. And that, that also has an effect, right? And so I think that when, there's a space within oneself to begin to understand, what's in one's heart, what's in one's actions. And there's in that sort of gap and space is really, an opportunity for change and transformation. So that's what I found in my own life, is that I thought I was a very nice person. When I first began, I suddenly realized there was a whole world inside me that was full of all sorts of, experiences, anger, frustration that I didn't know what to do with. And I think that's part of like this notion of human revolution, or seeing the mind, seeing one's behavior.
Yeah, and I'll speak to that as well. I think, one of the things that meditation practice can help with is to enhance our capability to be with contradictions. I think part of it is that we have these contradictions, like I hate capitalism, but I love online shopping, right? So it's just like, how can I be with both of those? My social work students, they have this passion for social justice and helping and caring and want to be of service, and yet they're living in this context and in these nonprofit organizations that are becoming more and more like corporations and are valuing the bottom line. And it's this contradiction, like how can you be with that? And so the meditation expands our capacity to be with contradiction. Life is full of contradictions. We're never gonna, that's never gonna not be the case. And sort of accepting that, I think, is really important. And then I just want to introduce two terms that come, that are Sanskrit terms that come from the Buddhist and yogic traditions. One is the term samskara, and samskara are basically what we would call today our neural pathways. So these are like the old habitual patterns of the mind, right? And so as Provost Steller was saying, we used to think those patterns were set in stone and could not change. But now we know that we can actually create new samskaras, new neural pathways. And that's what we can do. That's what our work here is to do, is to create new pathways. And so sometimes it might mean speaking out. Sometimes it might be not speaking out. Sometimes it might be self-care, going inward and reflecting and just having compassion for ourselves or someone else. It's stepping out of that habitual patterning. And that relates to one other term, is just that of karma. And so karma is just this idea. I think people get kind of confused about the idea, but karma means action, or it can also mean intention. And it can also, another term that I like to use for karma is momentum. And so karma is like our just momentum in the world. It's a result of past actions. Some would say past lives, but it's a result of our past actions. It's the way we're just habitual pattern to do things, which, for those of us who are prone to workaholism, it's just like you just can't stop. You're just doing it. The momentum is there. But the powerful news about karma, the good news, if I make it evangelical, is that it's action, it's change. Like we can change, like you can step out of that and change. And one of the ways to do that is slowing down and stopping and sitting still and being with it. And that's the first step.
All right, we have a few questions on this side of the room.
So, hello. I have two questions, but prior to that, I just want to say, going back to the point standpoint of the group meditation, the studies that have indicated, I can think of heart patients in particular who've been prayed for and to come through their heart issues far better than those who were not. I'm a live recipient of watching the action of prayer and meditation benefiting my then 16-year-old son, who was in a horrific car accident and was not alive at the time, but returned and was extremely fragile. His being was extremely fragile, but a whole number of events happened locally right within an intensive care unit to multiple denominations in the entire area to an online Facebook around the world prayer chain happened, and I'm just thrilled to report, despite having a traumatic brain injury, he has exceeded anyone's prognosis and functions at quite a high level. Has issues with the TBI, but functions at quite a high level. So, for which I am so grateful for everyone who was involved in all that. My two questions. One's pretty, I think, quick and simple, I hope, and that is, I wonder if anyone has any experience or read anything regarding the use of some essential oils such as frankincense with the use of meditation. Participants have frankincense having a high frequency level that is known to be very beneficial for brain potential, but also helping in focus and has a spiritual realm to it. So that's question one. Question two is probably more a longer question and answer, and that is, Dr. Pyles, you spoke to the accessibility issue for folks who I think of. I work with many of the schools in Albany City School District and can think about folks who are just moment to moment in survival mode, not necessarily having some of the customs and having some of the benefits of things like being able to take time at the beginning or end of the day, but literally I'm talking about moms who have 2 or more jobs and their oldest child, who's a middle school student, is responsible for getting 2 elementary students not anywhere near the middle school off to classes, off to school, is late daily for middle school, and takes the brunt of that from administration at the school, etc. So how do we make this accessible to folks who are in that mode, whose needs are so great, and to actually take that time off of being in that survival need to get your basic bread, food on the table, clothes for your children, sort of way?
Well, there's a huge movement around trauma-informed schools, mindfulness in the schools, and some of them are starting to include the parents as well. So that's very exciting, and research starting to be done on that as well. So I mean, certainly we need more of a community-based school concept as a way to address some of that stuff. I recommend checking out the work of Holistic Life Foundation. They're based out of Baltimore, and they've done some amazing things. 3 men of color started this organization that offers mindfulness and yoga to inner city folks in Baltimore, and it's a great resource.
Briefly to that as well. I think the wonderful thing is that it really is accessible. It's just a matter of, it's accessible in that many people do it naturally. They'll breathe, they'll take time for themselves, all of that. I think that once one really begins to connect, that it's not taking time away from your life, but it's actually adding time and space and a different rhythm in your life. That you, in many ways, by meditating and being mindful, you're putting yourself in rhythm, sort of with the larger rhythm of the universe. And there's a sense that our minds, because they're more quiet, actually become more capable of dealing with issues. I noticed this one time. I remember I had an hour to finish a project I thought would take 24 hours. And I finished it within, I sat for 15 minutes, chanted, and found myself finishing with 5 minutes to spare. And that's what we don't think. And there are also, I mean, my organization, it prides itself that it began in post-war Japan with educators, and it was the organization of the sick and the poor who began to meditate and really transform their lives. So in many ways, it's, and sometimes some of the most struggling areas are the ones who embrace this wholeheartedly and begin to see changes. So sometimes we have to also think of our access point. And children will gravitate to this much more quickly than adults do. And so, it's very natural they like this, they, wholeheartedly embrace this. So sometimes we have to get out of our own way and just recognize that sometimes we're the ones kind of keeping things from happening.
Okay, we have time for one more brief question and one brief answer. Everybody over there, so this side, so it's turn. Okay.
Here's a question.
There's a question there and there's a question in the back. I'm going to go in the back. Short question, short answer.
I chant already, and I'm trying to get more ideas on how to deal with some people that are really focused on me in a very negative way in this town. And, it's basically, I believe the military's behind it to test their new fangled weapons out on me. But there's a lot of slander about my life going on. My privacy is, people talking about my sexual life, and other people are told something different. Oh, she doesn't work, she's whatever. It's like I'm so hounded by this so much. And I really have compassion for people, but when I'm backed into a corner and I'm harassed daily, I get really, I'm really angry. I'm really chanting Heinz-Dieter to channel that anger in a really positive fashion, so that I don't destroy myself, because I would never hurt anybody else. I've never hurt anybody. Anyway, if you could, give me an answer of what you think, an approach that I could take towards these people that come at me, that are hurting me and trying to kill me. Thank you.
Okay, you're right. That was not a brief question. And it deserves more than a brief answer. So I wonder if, after we close out, if the panelists won't disappear immediately and perhaps you can connect with them and get the kind of answer to that kind of question there. Okay, so we have come to the end of our time. I hope to share my perception that this has been an amazing hour and a half, and if you could join me in thanking